Mekar Island is one of the few landmarks in Hyrule that Nintendo built and then simply left unexplained. It's a 40-foot circle of dirt in Lake Mekar near Korok Forest, with one dead tree standing at its center. That name belongs to a Korok whose entire story played out in another game long before this island ever mattered. That's why today I'm breaking down every detail of Mekar Island and what it might actually mean, starting with exactly where it sits and why that placement feels far too deliberate to ignore. Where Mekar Island is. Think of it like a crop circle with better production values, a perfect geometric shape sitting in the middle of open water with a single landmark at the center, radiating the distinct energy of something that was put there on purpose. Mekar Island sits in Lake Mekar in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, positioned directly west of the Great Hyrule Forest. You can stand at its edge and see the Korok Forest region from there, the most sacred piece of real estate in Hyrule, the place where the Master Sword sleeps. And between you and all of that gravity sits 40 feet of circular dirt. The shape is the first thing that stops you. Hyrule has organic land masses everywhere, irregular coastlines, asymmetric hills, terrain that reads like terrain. Mekar Island reads like a decision. It is a circle, clean enough that calling it an accident would require ignoring the geometry. A ring of grass and soil roughly 40 feet across, sitting isolated in the lake like a period at the end of a sentence nobody has finished writing. At the center stands one tree, a single leafless trunk rising out of dirt, the same silhouette in both games across two entries in the same era, which suggests somebody looked at the island again during Tears of the Kingdom's development and decided to keep the dead tree exactly where it was. In Breath of the Wild, the island holds a dead tree and bare dirt, with little else to reward the trip. Players who wait out there expecting a Korok puzzle or a hidden chest get the geometry and the silence, which is itself a kind of information. Monument design behaves this way: a specific shape, a specific central anchor, a deliberate emptiness where gameplay utility would go. If Nintendo's filler geography tends to be randomized and scattered, this island reads like it got a blueprint. Fans have long suspected a person is attached to that blueprint, even if the game never confirms it directly. Somewhere in the long sad math of Hyrule's history, a Korok wanted something simple, paid something much bigger, and ended up as a name on a map next to a dead tree. The players who keep returning to this island are doing exactly what you do when you visit a grave, standing in front of a marker, waiting for it to tell you more than it was built to say. That is the frustration. The design strongly suggests Nintendo made a choice here. The circle, the isolation, the placement within sight of the most important forest in the game, the visible elements carry the fingerprints of intention. The decision has never been officially explained. The map gives you the name of the island, and that name does more work than the geography does. Sit with it long enough, and it belongs to someone who has been absent from Hyrule across 2 games and an entire vanished ocean, and players keep walking back to a bare circle of dirt drawn at least in part by that single word on a map. The name. The island has a name, and the name is the entire argument. Mekar shows up in The Wind Waker as a Korok who plays violin in the Forest Haven. That's his whole deal. He's a small leaf creature with a violin and zero appetite for heroism, and the game drafts him anyway, reveals him as the Wind Sage, and sets him to work restoring the Master Sword's power for somebody else's fight. He gets the job done, the sword gets restored, Link wins the day, and Mekar presumably goes back to whatever Koroks do between somebody else's adventures. Then The Wind Waker ends, and 100 years of Zelda legend pile on top of everything that came after. Breath of the Wild came out in 2017 and put his name on a lake and an island inside it. The spelling shifts by one letter. Makar becomes Mekar. In English, that reads like a soft tribute, the kind of thing you'd almost miss if you weren't paying close attention. The cross-language match is where this stops being ambient. In Japanese, Makar's name Makaru becomes Makore, a vowel swap, and the island's Japanese name adds a doubled consonant on top of that. Different alphabet, different kind of edit, same character getting called back too. Both the English and Japanese releases carry the callback, which means the reference sat in the source material and survived localization on both sides. Nintendo has a long history of threading legacy names through new installments exactly this way, altered just enough to feel current but close enough to pull anyone who was paying attention back to something older. Lake Mekar and Mekar Island share the same reference root, which doubles the footprint. One shifted name you can file as coincidence. A lake and an island, in the same region, both carrying the same altered syllable from the same source character, means somebody in development made a deliberate choice and then made it again. What that choice means is where the canon ends and the reading begins. The naming connection is solid. The memorial interpretation sitting on top of it is a leap the evidence invites but cannot confirm. Breath of the Wild's item text, NPC dialogue, and environmental storytelling all leave the location unmarked, which means the tribute reading rests entirely on the name and the landscape rather than any caption or script line. The fan theory holding that Mekar is symbolically remembered here, with the dead tree standing in for a grave marker or monument, follows naturally from the name and the location, but it stays a reading rather than a record. Follow the pattern and it points one direction. A Korok, who gave his entire arc to somebody else's quest, honored quietly in a later timeline by a lake and an island carrying his name in a slightly altered form. The dead tree at the center of that empty circle, the one we noted had no obvious reason to be there, lands differently once the name clicks. A patch of bare dirt and a stripped trunk had one register before you knew what the island was called. The name pushes it into something that looks a lot like a memorial. A grave marker suggests a burial, and a burial suggests one body. Walk that island at night and count everything scattered across that patch of dirt, because the arithmetic does not stop at one. The bones. Mekar Island is barely wide enough to walk across in 20 steps, and the ground underneath those steps is packed with bones. That is the detail that turns a throwaway landmark into a crime scene. A pile of skulls and ribs scattered across a patch of dirt. This small is a density problem, the kind of body count you would expect from a battlefield, not a fishing spot on Lake Mekar. By day, the island plays it soft. Choo-choos wobble around the shoreline, jiggling and harmless, the kind of enemy a 10-year-old could farm for elemental jelly. Sunlight turns the whole place into a joke, a peaceful little sandbar you could skip past without a second glance. Then the sun goes down and the joke stops. Stalkoblin climb up out of the dirt, Stalizalfos rattle together on the rocks. Stalmoblin swing clubs built from their own leftover bones. Some of them show up already carrying elemental arrows, fire and ice and shock, fully equipped like whatever put them there wanted them ready for a fight the moment they stood up. That day and night switch is a design choice, a soft daytime mask over a nightly skeleton factory, and it repeats every single cycle forever with no version of the loop that skips a night. Walk past at noon and you would swear nothing lives here. Come back at midnight, and the same 40 feet of dirt is standing up and swinging weapons at you. Bokoblins and Moblins have flesh and blood versions all over Hyrule, wandering camps and highways in broad daylight. Stalkoblin and Stalmoblin are what is left after something already killed them once, reanimated husks wearing the same rusted armor they died in, still swinging the same weapons out of muscle memory that technically isn't muscle anymore. Finding that specific enemy type camped on one island, night after night, turns the island into a small, reliable undead operation running on a patch of ground the size of a backyard. Players notice the mismatch. A name lifted from a Korok who once restored the Master Sword, sitting on a mound of bones that turns out dead things on schedule, reads less like a rest stop and more like a headstone that never stopped working. Fan theories split over what that means. One side reads the bones as environmental dressing, a spooky flourish the art team dropped on a random island because Hyrule needed more of them scattered around the map. The other side reads it as the site of an actual massacre, a burial ground, or a leftover pocket of corruption that never fully cleared out after Calamity Ganon. Nothing in the game confirms either reading. The stronger case comes from the island's own behavior instead. These corpses get produced on a nightly loop, in a shape specific enough to look intentional, a set of enemies with a fixed roster and a fixed schedule rather than a random spawn table doing whatever it wants. That reading gets heavier once you remember whose name is stapled to this dirt. A Korok who wanted a life spent scraping a bow across a violin now has his name attached to a plot of land that manufactures the dead every night at sunset, a tiny musician's memorial that moonlights as a bone farm. For 6 years, this was where the trail went cold. A name, a dead tree, and a nightly skeleton problem sitting quietly on a lake many players might never sail across twice. Then a sequel arrived and put something on that dirt that only appears in about a dozen places in the entire kingdom, and it wears a familiar shape. The Phantom Ganon fight. 6 years after Breath of the Wild shipped, Nintendo went back to a 40-foot circle of dirt that sat in the first game without a word of explanation and buried a boss fight in it. For 6 years, that circle of dirt was one of the internet's favorite unsolved crime scenes, a dead tree, a ring of bones circling the roots like some kind of morbid welcome mat. Empty grass sitting alone in the middle of Lake Mekar with nothing else around it for 100 meters in any direction, roughly the length of a football field if the end zones were replaced with water. Fans built entire theories on that patch of ground, and the games offered nothing back. What happened here? A guy died, probably. Cool, thanks, very helpful. Then Tears of the Kingdom shipped, and the silence turned into a spear and a boss fight that few people had asked for out loud, but plenty had been quietly hoping for. Tears of the Kingdom keeps Mekar Island almost exactly as it was. Same dead tree, same bone pile scattered around the roots, same empty patch of grass sitting in the middle of Lake Mekar with nothing around it for 100 meters in any direction. Walk onto that island now, and the ground answers back immediately, because the moment Link's boots hit the grass, gloom spawn erupt out of the dirt. Clear the gloom spawn, and the island isn't done with you. Phantom Ganon rises next, one of the game's signature dark bosses, planted on the exact same 40 feet of ground the bones were already sitting on. Mekar Island becomes one of the locations across the kingdom where this encounter can appear, alongside other locations across Hyrule, some tied to Ganondorf's spreading corruption and some that are just random patches of ground. Several of those locations carry established names with weight behind them. Mekar Island came with a dead tree and a rumor. A tiny island with a dead Korok's name on it now sits in that company next to actual seats of power. That reads like a deliberate choice dressed up as an accident. There's a second detail buried in that same patch of dirt, and it might be the gentlest gut punch in the whole mystery. A metal chest sits near the tree roots, and inside it is a forest dweller's spear, a weapon built by Koroks. Mekar was a Korok. The island is named after him. Someone at Nintendo took a Korok-made weapon and buried it in the same soil as piles of bones on an island called Mekar, then said nothing about why. It reads like a burial rite with extra steps. Imagine being the one developer who has to place that spear in that chest, on that island, and just close the file without a comment explaining the choice to anyone. 2 readings sit side by side on this one, and neither is confirmed anywhere in the text. One says Nintendo looked at a spot fans had been theorizing about for years, and rewarded that attention with a real fight and real loot, turning curiosity into content. The fans keep asking about that island, let's give them something, is basically reading one in one sentence. The other reading runs the opposite direction. Developers spend a Phantom Ganon encounter and a Korok relic on locations they've already flagged as significant, and Mekar Island getting both suggests that flag existed from the start of development years before launch. Nothing in either game settles which one is true. What's certain is that a location, built entirely out of a name, a dead tree, and a bone pile just got handed a boss fight and a dead craftsman's spear, and the silence around, why, only got louder. So the developers signaled the place matters, and it feels like they chose a boss fight to say it rather than a single line of dialogue. A boss fight can take hours of design work and encounter tuning. A line of dialogue can take an afternoon and a voice actor. If that was a choice, Nintendo took the harder option anyway. That is worth sitting with, because Hyrule has been remembering its dead this exact way for decades, through geography instead of conversation. What the island represents. A widely discussed explanation for Mekar Island only works if a dead tree used to be a person. That sentence carries the whole theory, built from one name, one location, and nothing Nintendo has ever put in writing. Zelda has reused era-spanning names before, pulling faces and titles across games separated by decades and timelines, and Mekar sits inside that exact habit. The island's home in Lake Mekar sits within sight of the Lost Woods and Korok Forest, close enough that the geography does half the argument before a single fan opens their mouth. Canon never confirms this island is named for the Korok Sage from a game 2 console generations back, so treat the next few minutes as a labeled leap and not a documented fact. Follow the pattern anyway. Mekar was a Korok who wanted to play his violin in the Wind Temple and spent his entire existence restoring a sword for somebody else's war instead. Koroks are Kokiri, who changed shape after the forest changed around them, and a common reading holds that the last stage of that change is a tree. A single dead tree standing alone on a circle of dirt named after him carries a lot more weight once you know that detail. The same reading stretches further, and this is the part where the fourth rung of this argument earns its purpose. Hyrule has an observable pattern of keeping its old characters around as terrain, names, and ruins instead of dialogue boxes, and an island shaped like a grave marker fits that pattern with almost no resistance. The bones scattered nearby fit that same reading, deliberate set pieces on an island built to commemorate rather than decorate. The starkness reads like a choice, a place built to hold one fact and refuse to explain it. That is the entire appeal of the theory. It takes an island that does nothing, on a map full of islands that do something, and gives it the saddest job available. Standing in for a friend nobody currently in Hyrule is around to remember correctly, a Korok's whole existence gets compressed into a violin he only ever played in service of someone else's quest and a sword he spent decades tuning, and if this island carries his name on purpose, the last trace of him in the world is a circle of dirt with a dead tree standing on it. Here is the trap in that reading. It is the most satisfying answer available, and Nintendo has never once confirmed a word of it, which is exactly why people are still arguing about 40 feet of dirt years later, and why the arguing feels less like curiosity and more like a grudge. The frustration. The search is the experience. That is the entire design. Walk through what the island actually shows you. A 40-foot circle of elevated dirt sitting in the middle of Lake Mekar, carrying a name lifted from a story so old that no one left on the island remembers how it got there, marked by a dead tree where a living one should stand, scattered with bones that feel like they accumulated by accident rather than design, and hiding a forest dweller's spear under the soil like someone dropped it on the way out and never came back. In Breath of the Wild, you find that arrangement and your brain runs pattern recognition immediately. Unusual terrain, specific enemy spawns, a named location with a distinctive visual centerpiece. You start looking for the trigger. You check for chests, quest markers, hidden shrine entrances, the NPC who steps out from behind a rock. The game has trained you to expect all of that. You've found it everywhere else. It isn't here. The community response to that absence has been years of sustained, warm, slightly obsessive searching. You can find threads from players timing the blood moon, testing every item they own against the dead tree, mapping the bone scatter with coordinates, and comparing screenshots of the spear's buried depth across separate playthroughs, as if the pixel difference between two saves might be the thing that cracks it. The cut content camp has a real argument. The island's layout carries the fingerprints of something that didn't survive development. Fans have noted that elsewhere in Breath of the Wild, that specific combination of elevated terrain, a named landmark, and concentrated enemy placement tends to signal that something is actually there. The frustration that argument generates is completely earned, and it belongs to the people who built the case. Tears of the Kingdom dropped a Gloom Hands encounter above the island. You kill them, Phantom Ganon shows up, you kill that too, and when the smoke clears, the bones are still there, the dead tree is still dead. The name still reads as a transliteration of a Korok who stopped appearing in the series after a timeline branch. The lore filed under Resolved. The boss fight answered whether there was a threat on the island. It left the name sitting exactly where it was. Accept the island as a headstone rather than a locked door, and every detail that read like a clue for the past 5 years shifts its job. The 40-foot circle becomes a footprint, the ground pressed flat by something that stood there long enough to leave a mark. The cross-language name functions as an inscription, the kind carved into stone rather than programmed into a trigger. The bones and the buried spear sit the way objects sit at the base of a grave, present, purposeful, addressed to someone who already knows the full story and does not need it repeated. Mekar spent his existence as a Sage of Wind, restoring the Master Sword for a fight he never chose, and Hyrule moved on, the timeline fractured, the world flooded and dried into a plateau with shrine puzzles on it. And somewhere in that long passage, a small island in a lake kept a name that carries a Korok many players have never met. The players circling that island are doing exactly what you do at a headstone, standing there wanting more than the inscription while the inscription holds the line. A headstone gives you a name. The entire function of a headstone is that it withholds the rest. That want is the design. The search is the experience the island was built to produce, which means everyone who ever spent 20 minutes testing their inventory against a dead tree was reading Mekar Island correctly the whole time. The island was never going to hand over a clean explanation because a clean explanation would destroy the one thing it is actually doing. The frustration is the design working exactly as intended. Mekar Island is a headstone, and headstones are supposed to leave you standing there wanting more than a name, which is why the enduring iconography of that island comes down to a dead tree and a name that belongs to a Korok lost to the deep past that no one left on the island can explain. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.